Hello my guys, I hope that you are sitting comfortably and that you have a drink, because today I am going to be going through all of the books that I read in April and for Magical Readathon. So I did manage to complete my Magical Readathon TBR, like I got all of my prompts done. I did not read as much as I wanted to in April, and the main reason for that is that I read 9 books across the first 20 days of April, and then it took me 10 days to read 1 book. So I kind of saved some stuff for the end of the month that I then didn't end up getting to. So I'm rolling over 3 books and a novella into May, which I am not too thrilled about. But I did manage to read a book for every prompt I needed, both for the Demonologist and the Necromancer Calling for Magical Readathon, which I guess is or was my main aim. Getting into the stats, because it is hot as balls in this room and I needed to film in here because hello, brand new bedroom. I'm obsessed with this room, but my god, is it warm. So we're going to try not to dilly-dally about today. But getting into our stats, in April I read a total of 3,824 pages across 10 books, and this broke down to an average of 127 pages per day. So I did read a little bit less than I read in March, but more than I read in January and February this year. For the star ratings, we had 2 2 stars, 5 3 stars and 3 4 stars, breaking down to an average of 3.1 stars per book. So no 5 stars again this month, and the books that I read were overwhelmingly average. For the demographics, I read 1 young adult book and 9 adult. For the formats, I listened to 2 audiobooks and read 8 standardly formatted novels. For the genres, I read 4 fantasy books, 2 romance, 1 fantasy romance, 1 mystery, 1 paranormal and 1 thriller. And finally, for the places where I sourced these books from, 9 of them were from my own TBR that existed prior to the start of 2024, and 1 of them was a book that I got from the library. So getting straight into those reviews, the first thing that I did in April was episode 3 of Shelve It or Scrap It, which I will link it if you guys want to check it out. But the first book that was selected for that was Lunar Love by Lauren Kung Jessen. Now this one is a contemporary romance following a woman who is taking over her family's matchmaking business. We are moving into, or we already are in, the modern age where dating is moving online, and she is struggling to keep up and keep her business afloat with everything in the dating sphere kind of revolving around apps. So she is at this kind of matchmaking dating industry convention when she sees this guy who has created an app using the same concept as her family's matchmaking business, which is matching people based on their Chinese zodiac sign. So she then decides that she is going to use his service to try and match with him, to essentially mine him for information on how she can take him down and make her business better, because she feels like he has stolen the concept for her family's company. I gave this one 2 stars. I did not enjoy it, which is sad because I actually picked this between this and 2 different other contemporary romances because I thought that it sounded the most interesting. This is the one that I wanted to read. Considering she goes out of her way to match with him on purpose just to take him down and get information about his company, I thought that he was a very reasonable person, and at every opportunity in here she was completely awful to him and he was reasonable, to the point where he was becoming a doormat, because while she is doing increasingly worse and worse things to him, he was kind of just accepting it, and it really just did not sit right with me. As well as that, I thought that the writing and the dialogue, especially in here, was a little bit flat. It was very much like I felt aware that I was reading a book. It was almost like reading a script of NPCs in a video game, with how kind of flat and lifeless the text felt. So this one really did fall flat for me, resulting in a 2-star rating. Considering I expected to like that one, the next book is one that I thought that I was not going to love because the concept was a little bit too out there, and I need to remember to take my bookmarks out of my book is what I need to do. But I ended up really enjoying this one and I gave it a 4-star, and that is The Imaginary Corpse by Tyler Hayes. So this one, stay with me, is about a stuffed triceratops called Tippy, or is it? Yeah, it is Tippy, yes, who is also a detective. So this is set in somewhere called the Still Reel, which is essentially where ideas go when they are no longer needed. So think the imaginary friend that you grew out of, or a script that you spent a really long time working on but it never made it into production. These things all go to the Still Reel when the people who made them can no longer interact with them, can no longer have them with them, they go to the still reel. So this place is essentially the limit of your imagination, is the limits of this world. And that is why I loved it, because even though this sounds so out there, this is about a stuffed yellow triceratops in an imaginary world trying to find a serial killer. And it sounds so out there, but the world is so well developed that I just fell in love with this story. Now, the worst thing about this for me is that it is a detective story, because I typically don't enjoy those, but the world building was done so well that I thoroughly just enjoyed the exploration of this world that Tyler Hayes created. Because in the solving of this mystery, we go to new places where new concepts are explained, and it can be a little bit info dumpy like that, I guess, but I just thoroughly enjoyed the world building in here and how well done it was, because it's one of those things where, like, yes, this concept is so out there, but Tyler Hayes did such a good job and paid such attention to detail that he made it believable to me so that I could thoroughly immerse myself in this story. I've also really appreciated the duality of this, because a lot of this could have been turned into a children's TV show with this like stuffed triceratops detective who lives in a place, I think the place that he lives, the neighborhood he lives in, is called something like Playtime Town, which is exactly as it sounds. But underneath all of these like bright technical like kind of locations and like cute toy characters, you have a really sinister kind of motivation and plot lurking under here. And the more you dive into it, the more you kind of discover that while everything is like happy and colorful and bright, the reasons for this plot happening is much more sinister, and it is the people in the still reel that are trying to kind of get to the bottom of this to save the people around them, but also the people out in the real world as well. The next book that I read was Path of Daggers by Robert Jordan, which is book 8 in the Wheel of Time series. Sadly, this was not my favorite installment in the series. I did end up giving it 2 stars. If you are unfamiliar with Wheel of Time at all, it is a classic fantasy series following the struggle between light and dark. Everything in this world is cyclical. Everything that has happened will happen again in a new age, and we are following the Dragon Reborn, who is an influential figure in this battle between dark and light, as he assumedly eventually tips the scales of the world towards light for good. I know that this is the slog, like we're in the slog era here, but I have, if you guys have seen, I have been making spoiler videos on these books. I have actually decided that I'm putting them at least on pause right now, because I have so little to say about the events of this book. For the last book, which I also didn't make a spoiler video for, I had one thing, like I filmed one clip. For this, I had absolutely nothing. The events in these books that are kind of poignant and are interesting and are kind of making me get re-engaged with this text are so minor that I just feel like this is a lot of filler. It is a lot of back and forth between characters. Everyone is kind of moving towards something, but I don't feel like anybody is quite arriving, and so I'm leaving the books feeling like they're kind of redundant, which, like I said, I know that this is in the slog era. This is a common complaint with Wheel of Time. I am going to try with book 9 to get a little bit more involved with it again. I have discovered an app that Sandra told me about called Wheel of Time Compendium, which actually tells you about every single character. Like, it gives you a very brief, like 2-paragraph summary of what every character has been doing up until the point of the book that you're in, so that I can kind of get reacquainted, because at the minute we have lots of groups of people that are split into multiple factions with some quite similar names, and some of them we won't have seen for a couple of books, but they're maybe a little bit more relevant in like the current book that you're reading. And I'm really struggling to keep track of everyone, who they are, what they're doing, why they're relevant in this moment, who they're allied with, who we think they're allied with, but maybe they're actually allied with someone else. So when I get into book 9 in June, I'm going to want to kind of knuckle down and try and nail down all of these side characters, because as well as it being kind of dull at this point, it's also getting a little bit difficult to follow. And with books like 11 and 12 coming up at some point soon, because those I believe are some of the best books in the series, I want to be prepared to like thoroughly enjoy those installments like I enjoyed book 6. Next up, I read a book that I really wasn't expecting to love, and it blew me away, and that is Dating Dr Dill by Nisha Sharma. So I went into April wanting to read some contemporary romance, but after reading Luna Love and being quite disappointed, and also you will know that over the last, I want to say, year or so, I have had a very up and down relationship with romance after previously like falling in love with it over 2020 to 2022. So I picked this up kind of expecting the worst, and I truly got the best. So this one is about a woman whose house is being sold by her father. It is the house that him and her mother built together, but her mother has passed away. He is wanting to retire, sell the house and move to Florida. However, this house is our main character's passion project and she really wants to buy it from her father. However, she doesn't have the money, but himself and her mother did set aside a big pot of money that is for her and her sister when they either decide to buy a house and get married. So the main character, who is called Karina, wants this money, but her father will not give it to her unless she is engaged. On the flip side of that, we have Dr. Dill. He is a doctor, he's a heart surgeon, but he does not believe in love. And he has this television show where he essentially talks about heart health, but also the way that love and like emotion plays into heart health. And he ends up hooking up with our main character, and the day after, her sister, who is an influencer, is going to be on his show. And when she finds out who he is and how he doesn't believe in love, they end up having a very big argument that blows up and goes viral on social media and ruins his chances of opening a clinic for the community in his neighborhood or in this city, which is what he's been working towards because his investors pull out. However, his mother has told him that she will pay him a lot of money if he gets married. So these two, while they hate each other, kind of dance around the idea of fake dating because Karina believes in true love and Dr. Dill, is he called Prem? Yeah, Prem doesn't. They constantly dance around this like growing attraction between them. I loved the banter and the sexual tension between these two. It is also, I didn't realize this until I found out that this was a series. This is a Taming of the Shrew retelling. It's part of a trilogy called, I think, is it If Shakespeare Was an Auntie? And it is 3 Shakespearean retellings following the main character Karina's best friends and also Prem's best friends, obviously pairing up. But 10 Things I Hate About You, which is my favorite movie, or one of my favorite movies, is also a Taming of the Shrew retelling. So when I found that out, it kind of really put the cherry on top of this for me. There is some things, like I knew this going in, which is why I was worried. Prem calls one of his body parts Charlie, and it's used really weirdly because he never explains why he calls it Charlie, but also the correct names and the more common names for that piece of anatomy are also used in this book. So I did think that it was really odd and it did take me out of it a little bit. But if you too have heard that, it is not as frequent as I assumed that it would be, although it is a little bit odd. But yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed this one and I've actually picked up the sequel, which is currently £1.50 at the works, and I hope to be getting to that sometime soon. The next book that I read was Magic Study by Maria V. Snyder. This one is the second book in the Poison Study series and also the Chronicles of Ixia, which is a longer like 9-book series broken down into 3 trilogies. I think it's still 9 books. The author is currently publishing these books from the male character's perspective, but I don't know where they technically come, whether they come in as like 10, 11 and 12 or like 1.5, 2.5, etc. But anyway, this series is following a young woman called Yelena who has been or is about to be executed for the murder of the son of a general. When her death day, I guess, is approaching, she is pulled from the dungeons by the commander's advisor and assassin Malik and offered a job as the commander's food taster testing for poisons. So she obviously takes him up on this opportunity. However, the man whose son she's murdered is not happy because he feels that he has been slighted and that justice is not being served, and so she is currently always looking over one shoulder to see when the next attack from this guy is coming. This second book does take this story into a little bit of a different direction because it opens up the world a lot and we are exploring a completely new location and a new group of people. The history, like the political background of this world, is that it used to be ruled by magicians and a royal family, but the commander came in and he killed everyone, took over, and it is a much more, I want to say, like fair society. There's less excess. He's not a big fan of art, but everybody is treated much more fairly. However, obviously the magicians of the world and people related to the royal family are still not happy about that, and this book explores that a little bit more as Yelena also learns a little bit more about the magic of this world. I did enjoy this one, although not as much as I enjoyed Poison Study. I think that this has a lot of unlikable characters, and based on how much I liked some of the characters from the first book, it was a little bit difficult to get into when a lot of the side characters were just people that I could not get behind. It did pick up a little bit halfway for me, and I did actually enjoy the romantic subplot in this one a little bit more. I don't know why it was there in book one, but it didn't feel like it was particularly emotive, whereas in here I enjoyed the connection between those two characters a little bit more, and I also enjoyed the appearance of some of my favorite side characters. I did feel like when we got to the end of this one that it did start to feel just a little bit rushed, because we have a lot of little plot threads running through this book that are obviously also going to be explored further and running into book 3, but I felt we got to the last, like, I don't know, 80 pages of this and it was a scramble to tie up all of them one after the other, which I really just didn't think was necessary given how they had quite organically grown throughout the rest of the book and how it's quite obvious that they are also going to be leading into book 3. So this one, I think I did give it 4-star, but it was a very low 4-star. There's still a lot I enjoy about this one, but I just think based on the end, it's not quite as good as book 1. Next up, I read Orphea by Joanne Harris, which is a book that I've had for a while because it is a fae story. I read Chocolat by Joanne Harris many years ago, but this is a very different kind of story, and I really did not know what to expect from Joanne Harris's fantasy books. This one is essentially a modern fairy tale about a woman whose daughter died. I can't remember how long before the start of the book she died, but obviously like the death of a child is tragic and very difficult. So this woman, the only way that she can really process her feelings or like continue to exist at all is by running. So every night she just runs through London. One day when she's doing this, she steps between the cracks into a fae world where she discovers that her daughter may be within her reach and may not have died at all. So it's following this woman's journey to save her daughter. So this I enjoyed. I liked it, but like with Nettle and Bone by T. Kingfisher, while I do think that it is very good and like works very well as a fairy tale, in terms of my personal enjoyment, it is not something that is going to stick with me for an especially long time. This book does also have stunning illustrations. I read it pretty much in one sitting as well because it has both half page and also full page illustrations throughout here, and I think that in terms of it being a fairy tale, it did work well. It captured kind of the whimsy and unpredictable nature of the fae, which in terms of a fairy tale does work really well. In terms of my personal enjoyment, I don't really love whimsy. It did remind me a lot of Alice in Wonderland as well. There are some paragraphs in like verse in here or from like, I think it's from folklore that reminded me a lot of like the Jabberwocky, and also like I said, we have these very unpredictable whimsical figures, also some very like Mad Hatter like characters in here. So I feel like if you are somebody who likes modern folkloric fairy tale type stories like this, you will enjoy it. I did enjoy it, but I know it's not going to stick with me very well, so I gave it 3 stars. I then attended an event in London for the launch of Scarlett St. Clair's latest book, which is the last book in the Hades and Persephone series. So while I was going to spend 6 hours on train that day, I decided to continue on with the Hades and Persephone series myself, and I picked up A Game of Fate. So this one is the first book from Hades' perspective. The books alternate between Persephone and Hades, with Persephone's books focusing on more of like a contemporary fantasy or like romantic plot, and Hades books are a little bit more fantasy, like high fantasy within the plot lines. It is also alternate history because it's set in a world where the gods came down to reside amongst humans. So like the Greek gods are the main gods of this world, but they do have a presence both in the mortal world and in their own domain. So Hades is present both in the mortal realm where he has a gambling empire and in the underworld where he is obviously the ruler. So Persephone is studying at New Athens University and she is about to graduate and become a journalist. So one day she ends up at Hades' invite only club because her roommate has an invite. Hades offers to teach her to play poker, but she has no idea who he is, and he doesn't tell her that if she loses, she will be trapped in a bargain with him. That is inevitably what happens, and he tells her that she can win her freedom if she manages to make life grow in the underworld. However, Persephone Persephone, whilst being the goddess of spring, is actually unable to access her powers, and anything living, like any plant or anything that she touches, shrivels and dies. So I think that this series is very enjoyable. I think that they're very immersive. I really like Scarlett St. Clair's writing. I do find that they don't stick with me particularly well. Like, while I kind of get into the story and fly through them, the details of the story don't really stick with me. I do really like the relationship between Hades and Persephone. It almost feels like a novelization of Lore Olympus, which is something that I really like about it. And I really like the tension and the romantic relationship between them. I do think that things can progress a little bit too quickly in this series, where I would maybe prefer things to be a little bit slower and explored in a little bit more depth. But overall, I am having a good time with this series and I will continue. Some of the scenes in this book are the same scenes as in the first book, but from Hades' perspective. However, it has been quite a while. It's been over a year since I read A Touch of Darkness, I think. So I can't say at this point like how redundant it is having them from Hades' perspective. I did find that because it's been such a long time since I read A Touch of Darkness, that I enjoyed those scenes and enjoyed this book, where they kind of like rang a bell to me. But I don't know whether they were overly repetitive or whether we got actual useful insight from reading from Hades' perspective. So sadly, for those of you looking to go into this series and you want to know whether like it's pointless or whether it's you get a lot of added value from reading Hades books, I do think that Hades has a lot of plot that Persephone doesn't, and I do believe, I have heard that that is critical to the later books in the series. But it wasn't tedious for me reading the same scenes again because it's been so long since I've read A Touch of Darkness. Overall, I gave this one 3 stars. The next book I picked up was book 2 in the Pretty Little Liars series by Sarah Shepherd, which is flawless. You'll know if you saw my last wrap up or one of my vlogs from last month that I read Pretty Little Liars. I didn't pick it. I used a spinner wheel to pick a book. Pretty Little Liars came up. I thought I would hate it and I ended up thoroughly enjoying it. So this month, once again during my Patreon 24-hour readathon, I continued on and picked up book 2. So this, if you are familiar with the TV show, you will know it is about a group of girls who were best friends, and I think it's about 2 years before the story starts. One of them goes missing and she's kind of the ringleader of the group. She's a little bit of a bully. She's holding them all together. And after her disappearance, they all kind of drift apart from each other. However, now that they're all back in the same location again, going into a new year of school, they start to receive anonymous texts threatening to reveal their secrets, signed with the initial A, which is the initial of the girl Allison that went missing. However, as things start to unfold in this series, they realize that it can't possibly be Allison who is texting them, and they start to group together and rekindle their friendship to get to the bottom of who is blackmailing them. This has a ton of content warnings and also like really problematic behavior. There are romanticized relationships. There's not only a teacher-student relationship, there's romanticized relationships with guys who are significantly older, like a good 3 to 5, I want to say, years older than these girls who are teenagers in high school. There's lots of talk of like eating disorders and disordered eating, and lots of bullying, slut shaming, girl hate, all of that stuff that was super common at the time that these books were published. And I think that this is like a really good time capsule of media aimed at teenage girls in the early 2000s. And I honestly love it for that, not in a way that like I accept and condone any of this stuff that we no longer thankfully see present in literature, but just because it feels so nostalgic to me. Because when this book was published in like 2006, maybe 2007, I was 14. So I was the same age as these girls, and this type of media is what I was constantly consuming. When I went into these books, I knew that they would contain all of this stuff, so it's not like it's a shock or a surprise to me, especially because I've also seen all of the show. But I did think that they would be really badly written and hard to get through, and I actually think that they're very compelling, and for that reason, that is like why I've continued on. So I gave this one like a low 4-star. I didn't think it was quite as strong as the first book, but I'm still really enjoying this series. And at this point in book 2, we have just had the major point where these books, or like where the show started to diverge from the books. So we're now getting into content that I don't know. Like, I don't know very much about how the books are different from the show. I just know that they are, because that always happens when you have show like with Gossip Girl. Very, very different. I did not foresee this like 100%, but I'm rolling with it because I'm loving these books, if I'm being honest. Another audiobook that I listened to in April was A Flicker in the Dark by Stacey Willingham, and I was very torn about this one while I was reading it for the longest time. This is following a woman who is a psychologist, I think, but she is also the daughter of a serial killer. When she was a teenager, girls in her town started to go missing, and it was uncovered, it was revealed that her father was the one responsible. So he is in jail, and it has been 20 years when she is contacted by a journalist who is wanting to write an anniversary piece on this murderer, and also like get an update of like where his children are and how his family are doing 20 years on from this incident. So she obviously doesn't want to talk to this journalist at all, but then girls that are kind of not anything to do with her but suspiciously close to her, like she was potentially the last person that saw them alive, or they don't live too far away from her, girls like that start to go missing, and the main character starts to worry that it's somebody targeting her because of who her father was, or that it's something to do with the anniversary of her father's imprisonment rolling around. So I thought that this was very predictable. I did like the audiobook. The narration was nothing special, but like it did the job. But I thought that this was very, very predictable, and I thought that I knew what was going on very, very early in this book. And I kind of did, but the way that the plot twist was revealed, like I had a couple of options of what the thing, like the reveal could be, and one of the things that I guessed was the thing that actually happened. With thrillers, it can go two ways. It can go where like you predict the end and that is the way that the thriller goes and it ends and you guess the ending, or there can be another plot twist, and I always find that you never really know which one of those is going to be until you finish the book. Thankfully, this was one of the ones that did surprise me because it was one with that extra plot twist, and so by the end of this, like I found that I'd had a good time with it. It was enjoyable. The narration was enjoyable while I was walking Brie, while I was doing stuff. So it served its purpose. It was entertaining. The plot twists were decent. And it was, to me, like a very average, decently done thriller, which is honestly like I couldn't have asked anything more from it. So I gave it 3 stars. It didn't really stand out to me in any way, shape or form, but it did the job of what I want a thriller for. And then the final book, the book that was the bane of my existence for the last 10 days of the month, is Shadow of Night by Deborah Harkness. And you guys warned me about this book, but I still did not feel like I was adequately prepared. So this is a sequel to A Discovery of Witches, which is essentially Twilight for adults, and that is honestly why I love it. Like, it was so good. I loved A Discovery of Witches. But it is following this witch who doesn't really practice her magic, and she is she's doing a research project at Oxford, and one day she accidentally calls forth this manuscript that pertains to the origins of the creatures of the world, which are the witches, vampires and the demons. So this has nothing to do with her research project, so she sends it back to the library, and she starts to notice in the days that follow that these creatures are starting to congregate around her for some reason. They reveal to her that it's because of this manuscript, which has actually been lost for centuries, and they would like her to call it again and give it to them for whatever reason it is that they want it for. One of these people that congregates around her at this time is an ancient, powerful, handsome vampire called Matthew, who has noticed that the species, especially the vampires, are declining and their strength is waning over the decades, over the centuries. So he would like to investigate the origins of creatures to kind of try and remedy that. Over the course of the book, like, Matthew takes it upon himself to protect Diana from everybody else who is now trying to harm her to get this manuscript, and it is a romance between the two of them. So I expected this series to be very, very pretentious and difficult to read, but it's actually like the first book is compulsively readable, and I ate it up. Like, it was Twilight in so many ways, in the way that it's written, in the way that it reads, and also the story beats are very similar to Twilight. I loved it. Going into this one, I knew that it was going to be a little bit different because Deborah Harkness is a historian, and something that I love about this series is that while these historical references go right over my head, I trust that Deborah Harkness knows what she's talking about. So all of these little historical details and historical people and references that she adds into the book really ground it in reality for me, me and make the story and the world seem really fleshed out, three-dimensional and believable. So I did not know. I knew that historical fiction would play into this at some point, and I was told that it's mainly in this book where it's relevant, and the majority of this book takes place in a different time period. And I like historical fantasy while I don't like historical fiction, so I was really interested to see how that would play out, how I would feel about the time period, which is 16th century England and also a little bit of Europe. And I was really excited to explore all of that, and this is definitely an exploration of the time period. I feel that this book was quite indulgent on behalf of not only Deborah Harkness, who was really just having fun exploring and fleshing out this time period, but also on behalf of the characters. Like, some of the stuff that I had to read about, we had like a solid plot that needed to be followed. Like, shit needed to get done in 16th century England, and in my opinion it had to get done at like an amount of pace. Like, we needed to go into this book, get the stuff done that we wanted to do, and get out like as quickly as possible. But instead what we have is Diana worrying about how to manage a household in the 16th century and being a good and proper 16th century wife. And I'm just like, this is just not, no, this is not why we're here. I thought that the characters were really indulgent in kind of settling in this period, exploring this period, and also their relationship a little bit more, when I felt like, based on the nature and the conditions of this book, we really needed to focus on the plot. And even when I got to the end, when I was in the last 50 pages, when they were saying they were going to get the thing done, it still took them forever to do it. One thing that remains true about this, I gave it 3 stars because one thing that remains true about this book is that I still really like Deborah Harkness's writing style, and I do still really love the atmosphere. The atmosphere was still like on par with The Discovery of Witches. However, I do feel like we had a very slow, tedious pace in parts. Like, there were parts where it picked up and got really interesting and then kind of dropped off again, and then also like a little bit of a lackluster plot line. I have to say my least favorite thing, while I still enjoy it, is the romance in here, and we spent quite a bit of time on that I didn't really care about, mainly because I don't really like Matthew. I find him to be quite old-fashioned, and in some elements he's quite controlling and a little bit too dominant for my tastes. But despite that, like, I do still like the romance, but it is truly the writing and the atmosphere that I'm in it for. And I will say that my favorite thing is how believable Deborah Harkness has made this, because of the attention to detail and the little historical references that we have sprinkled and scattered throughout here. So I am going to continue on with this series, because honestly, like I've said this in my vlog where I read this book, where I finished it, if something's well written and the atmosphere is on point, it doesn't matter how terrible the plot is, I will still see it through. And I enjoyed the read. It got tedious because it took me 10 days, but I did enjoy my time reading this book, so I will definitely be continuing on to book 3, which I've heard is generally like quite a bit better. So those are all the books that I read in April. Still quite a lot, even though I diverted a little bit from what I should have been reading, which meant that I'm now rolling over books to May, which I feel like I've done a really good job of not doing that this year so far. But down in my comments, please do let me know what your guys' favorite book that you read in April was, and also if you would like to leave me a little something but you don't feel like you have anything to say, leave me a moon emoji for Shadow of Night. But aside from that, guys, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it, and subscribe if you wanna. If you head to my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, Instagram and Twitter if you'd like to follow me on any of those, as well as links to my Bookish Candle website, the Etsy for that, and a 10% off discount code. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye.
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you're a go when nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.